Well, hi everybody, and welcome to our first conversation. My name is Luke Jackson, and along with our team, I have the privilege of being a part of leading Radical Middle Ministries. We heard in the first moment about what Radical Middle Ministries is and a little bit of the vision. What I wanted to do in this moment is talk with my mom, Betsy Jackson, about where Radical Middle comes from, the history of who we are, and essentially where we're going. So, Mom, thanks for doing this.
Well, thanks.
It's really fun. So maybe just for everybody who doesn't know the history, doesn't know where we're coming from, why don't you tell us just a little bit about you and then Dad and how you grew up? Where were you both coming from?
Okay, your dad was from Park Ridge, Illinois, outside of Chicago, in a probably upper middle class family. I came from the desert in California. I grew up on a military base. I would say probably lower class.
Okay.
Dad was in an environment where education was really fostered. Goal setting was really part of the identity of his family. I grew up in something very opposite.
Okay.
Where you either went to junior college or got a job. That was the lesser of the two evils.
Got it.
So,
okay.
Anyway, we grew up very different. He grew up in the city. I grew up kind of in the rural area. He was academic. I was not. So we didn't have a lot in common. We met. His first fiancée, Janet, was killed in a biking accident in California while they lived in Illinois. And she was out here on a campus crusade or intervarsity trip. She was a leader. They were both leaders in intervarsity. And she was hit by a van up in St. Louis. And she was killed. And then a year after that, your dad moved from Chicago out here to San Diego, where we met, which is a funny story. He was sitting in Balboa Park reading his Bible, which at that time was the color of your cup, that orange cup.
Okay.
Huge.
Just orange Bible.
Yeah, okay. Big Bible. Back in the days, we had big Bibles. And because we didn't have, internet, so we didn't have Bible apps.
On your phone,
yeah, we didn't have that. So one of my friends, I went to Calvary Chapel in San Diego, and one of my friends was jogging through the park and saw him sitting on this hill with this big old orange Bible and said, "Hey, bro, where are you going to church this morning?" And Dad had just flown in the day before. Okay. They had no idea. So he invited him to Calvary. And I was leading worship at Calvary. And so we met in the aisle of the church. And I was not at all attracted. I just thought he was another sailor from San Diego. Okay. I had never dated anybody really with hair that wasn't longer than mine, and your dad's hair was all cut off. And so, he was a nice guy. He talked funny, and but then we started a Bible study at my house in Mission Bay, and it grew from the 4 or 5 of us that got together to over 200 in a matter of a couple of months.
Wow.
And so I knew there was something up with this guy. He didn't just, he was from Wheaton College. He'd gone to Wheaton College. But he really had passion for the Word of God in a way that I wasn't used to. I hadn't seen before. And so I obviously knew, okay, this guy's not your run-of-the-mill guy when it comes to Bible teaching. And so, one thing led to the other, and we were married, and then we went back to seminary in Boston. Okay. Which was really hard for me. I'd never lived outside of Southern California. Didn't even own any closed-in shoes. And we went back to there and back to Gordon Conwell, and right north of Boston. And he went to seminary. I worked. And while he was at seminary, he had 2 classes that were very influential in his life that really propelled the whole direction of RMM. One was with Christy Wilson, who, if any of you care to know about missionaries early on, Google Christy Wilson. He was the first or one of the first missionaries in Afghanistan. And he taught at the seminary at Gordon Conwell. He was extremely influential in opening our eyes to the fact that there was people groups all over the world that had never heard of Jesus. We would learn more about that when we went to the U.S. Center for World Mission here in Pasadena. And then the other professor was Dr. Gordon Fee, who we became very close with his whole family. Gordon Fee taught New Testament, Old Testament, hermeneutics, all kinds of things, and was just a wonderful man of God, is a wonderful man of God. And between the two of them, they encouraged your father to write, to read, to share along the way, because they knew there was something on him for the world. So anyway, we finished up Gordon Conwell, came back to California, to Pasadena. We had, at the end of our time at Gordon Conwell in 82, Jax went to a small conference at a church in Melrose, Massachusetts, where John Wimber was teaching. And it was the first exposure we had had. It was a vineyard by then here in California. Anyway, Dad went to this conference. I stayed home. You had just been born. And you were born in 83, so it must have been 83 the conference was. And anyway, Dad asked Wimber all kinds of theological questions. And got all the answers that he wanted. They were the right answers for your dad. So we came back, and Wimber back in those days would just say, come hang out, see if it's for you. So we did that. We came back to California. Jack started working at the U.S. Center for World Missions. He was a writer for the Christian Missions magazine there. And so throughout our life, we've raised support. That was one of the ways we did. He worked there, and we had a donation base, or whatever you want to call it. And so we did that for a year and a half, and then we felt like the Lord was calling us back to the Midwest to plant a vineyard. So we left, went to Indianapolis, planted a church there, and then years later went to Happy Layman's Church in Champaign-Urbana, where Dad became the training pastor, and architected a pastoral school there, where he taught. And it was during this time that he began really pulling all of the information that he had done in private, he now began to do publicly. And at Hap's church, Hap would have him go out, it seemed like once a month, to different churches in the area and around the world, and teach what he had been working on, which was his storyline of the Bible. He had developed it into a lecture of 7 hours, where he would go from Genesis to Revelation. It wasn't chronological. I don't know, do you want to go into what NGSI is now? Or
so essentially that entire process leading up to that point, if we were to ask the question, like, where did Radical Middle Ministries begin? Where did the vision for it begin? Would the season you're now describing kind of be the genesis of Radical Middle?
It would be, in the sense that we knew it was larger than Dad just writing a book about and doing conferences. We didn't really know back then what the platform would look like. But when in 1990, we went to a pastor's conference in Denver, a Vineyard Pastors Conference in Denver, and Wimber asked your dad to take the first half hour of every morning prior to the morning session and teach us on the theme of missions in Scripture. So Dad started pulling together everything he had been working on
for all those years leading up to that. All those years
outside of that. All the way back to seminary, when he encountered Christy, Wilson. That was like,
So all those years, the Spirit had just been preparing.
Right, and he had been writing and researching and praying and really going before the Lord. And what is this? And so that was the impetus for him pulling it all together in a very early draft.
Okay.
And during that conference, as he was teaching, there would be parts of his lecture where he would stop and say, nothing's going to stop this. And so
what was he referring to?
He was referring to God's plan from Genesis to Revelation.
Okay.
It was, he called it Nothing's Going to Stop It because the audience would then repeat back to him, nothing's going to stop it. And that must have happened. It happened every day while he was teaching, probably 3 or 4 times during his talk.
So is that where the name Nothing's Going to Stop It
That's where
comes
the
from?
name
That's the
Nothing's Going to
Genesis?
Stop It.
Huh.
What it is it's Nothing's Going to Stop It is a 7-hour lecture from Genesis to Revelation, but it's pulling out the stories that move the grand story forward. It's like a movie. When you watch a movie, there's all kinds of scenes in a movie.
Right.
Not all of them are necessary to get the plot line. They
I see.
add,
Okay.
but they're not necessary.
Right.
There are those that are necessary. If those were pulled out, you wouldn't know what in the heck was going on.
And if you only had each individual without all the rest,
With
the
all
whole
the rest,
movie
it
wouldn't
wouldn't
come
make.
into
It
being.
would be all these little stories, and that was one of the things your dad. That's how he was taught in Sunday school. You know, David in Lion's Den.
Right.
You know, they're all separate little stories.
Right. We do our flannel graphs. In
Right.
his
You
era,
get
that would have been.
right.
Yeah.
You know, you get your little coins for knowing all the Bible things and
Get your little stars.
right.
Right.
So, but they're not connected, and they are connected.
Yeah.
They are connected. There is a grand story of God's to redeem the world. And so through writing all of this and lecturing and doing that 1990 conference, he was able to put together a notebook or a book that was in outline form on all of the stories that drive the narrative forward. You could probably explain it in another way, but for me, it's like it is like a movie. There are certain stories that are absolutely necessary to understand the plot line.
Yeah.
What is God? What is his plan? What's his purpose? And then how is he going to accomplish it?
Yeah.
So his plan, there's only one plan of God. Nothing's going to change it.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to stop it. And there's one way that God's going to do it, and that's through his people, through the power of the Spirit.
Yeah.
So that's it in very simple.
Right.
That's Betsy
version.
form.
Yeah.
You know, that's my paraphrase.
Was there always Jack's form and Betsy form?
Oh, always. Good Lord, he was like off in the you know. I called him Swillhead because he was so intellectual that there were times. I mean, I remember when he would preach, we would all of his staff would say, you only get one big word per sermon. Then after that, one of us would
cut him off.
Cut him off.
Yeah.
And but that's just who he was.
Yeah.
You know, he was a scholar. He studied. He loved the Word of God. He loved Jesus. So in 2004.
Real quick, let me back up before you go into that. So as he got commissioned to go out and he started traveling around the world teaching Nothing's Going to Stop It, what was the feedback like along the way? Like in those early years, what was happening as people were experiencing that material?
Well, the biggest response we got, or the most common response we got, was that I've never seen that before. I've never been taught that before. In other words, they'd never been taught that God has one plan and he's going to use his people to accomplish it. And that means that everybody has a part to play in the accomplishment of God's global plan.
Yeah.
And so instead of seeing your little story, I'm a housewife, that's all I am, to I am a housewife, and that is not all I am. I have been
so you're caught up in something larger now.
Caught up in something much bigger than yourself, and knowing that that's God's desire for every one of his kids to be caught up in his bigger story. What part do they play? And you can't know your part in a play unless you know the play, unless you know what the play's about, from beginning to end. We can get caught up in the little stories, but how do individual little stories, how do they apply to our lives?
Right.
it's the grand story of what all those little stories tell us about the plan of God.
All right, let me ask you this, Mom, because obviously I know that you and Dad both together, but you really have a heart, obviously, to shepherd people and have done that for years. So let me ask you this. Okay, so over the years of walking with people through their journeys, what are the obstacles you've seen on a local level to people, one, discovering that larger story, but then more, maybe on a more personal level, what are the obstacles you've seen to people actually seeing themselves caught up in that story? Like you said, just going from like, well, this is just my life. This is just what I do. I go to church, go to small group, whatever. What are the obstacles that keep people from living the larger thing that you're describing?
Well, right off the top of my head, I would say risk.
Meaning what?
Meaning have been always afraid to take risks, and your dad took risks all the time. I think to jump from our little story into the big story, I don't think it's a jump. I think it's a process of understanding where you fit, where your story fits in the larger story. And then asking God, how do I play that out? How do I play my role? How do I love my neighbors? How do I become a goer or a sender? One of the things with your dad and I, which was very different, he always saw himself as going to the nations. I never really had that call. Now, I love the nations. I love to travel. But he would be the one to go. But I never felt slighted or denied anything because I knew my role as sender was just as important as his role in going. And so I sometimes I wonder if people understand that even globally, they can play a bigger part than they think they can. Learning how to love, learning how to be like Jesus in whatever context God has you in. But I think the missing link for me is, back to your question, is you have to make the link between the connection between your life and the larger story of God, or your life just becomes kind of mundane and perpetuating the same things.
You've seen church all over the world. You've seen church in all different forms, all different movements. I know you and Dad experienced. What would be the obstacle? So you mentioned the link. What have you seen in the way church is done, maybe the way we live out church life, that keeps the link disconnected? Like, what are the disconnects for?
Well, this probably won't go over real big with a lot of people, but...
Well, just go for it.
Yeah, I am. I think we get myopic in our view of what church is to a Western church. And I love the Western church. I'm part of the Western church. But across the world where I've gone, where your dad's gone, where what I've seen is that church becomes more of a business here in the West. We kind of lose our ability to, be Jesus and not play a role. What am I trying to say?
Well, what keeps us? Okay, so what keeps us from walking that out?
We have other things in our life that gobble up our time and our energy and our resources, and we have to be aware that those time, resources, and energy, they belong to the Lord. They don't belong to our kids. They don't belong to our job. They don't belong to our church. They belong to Jesus. And so to be able to, I don't know how to.
Well, let me ask you this. So in the way that churches are led, you and Dad led churches for years, right? You've been part of communities.
Right.
So if the priorities you're describing are to be about what God is about, what are some of the priorities that can get us off track? Let's just go practical for a minute. As people are discovering their role, as we go forward as Radical Middle Ministries, and we have these moments along the way, people are going to be hearing conversations from people from really different perspectives, right? We're going to be sharing things that we're learning. What are the things that easily can take up all that time that you would say in your wisdom, living all these years and seeing it? And we're not paid to play safe, so what would you call a spade a spade? What would you say?
We major on the minors and minor on the majors. In
what would
other
be some
words,
of the minors we major on?
Politics.
Meaning what?
Meaning the division, the arguing that Christians do over right and left, Democrat and Republican, and walls and no walls. Those are all important things. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, at the end of our lives, God's not going to ask us if we were Republican or Democrat. He's going to ask us if we loved. Did we love?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, and I know for a fact, because I have friends of mine that are on the opposite side of the political scope than I am, and we love each other.
Yeah.
We're able to agree to disagree and know that love is preeminent. Love of each other, love of the church, love of the unchurched is paramount to any of those disagreements or arguments or rights that we think we have as Americans or whatever we deem ourselves.
Right.
I don't think we have any rights. I mean, our rights were nailed at the cross. And so we can have our preferences, which I think God allows us to have, but I don't think he ever intends for those preferences to be divisive.
Okay.
And so I think that's one of the ways we can. I think another way is in the Western church, when it becomes a business, it just happens. Nobody means for it to happen. It just happens. People become dollar signs. I know that because it happened to me. I would see people come to our church and all I would think about is, I wonder what kind of car they drive. I wonder what kind of business. I wonder how much they're going to tithe.
Right.
You don't mean to do that. You just do that.
Yeah.
Until God takes it all away. And then you realize, maybe it wasn't so important to think about those things. I think we put task before people. We put programs before purpose. We want to make sure that we have every program imaginable so that more people will come to our church. And I'm not saying any of this is bad or wrong. Yeah. I just think the non-Western church is growing faster than our church, and it doesn't look anything like us. I'm not saying we have to import that church. I don't think it would work.
Right.
But I do think we have things we can learn from that church. Those people, I think affluence is another hindrance to the church in America.
Okay, unpack that a little bit. So how would money play into what you've seen over the years?
Money becomes our God. And I think it happens subtly. I think, we start off with, God, just give me what I need.
Yeah. And
then our need grows a little bit more. I need more space. I need a bigger car. I need. And I do that. But I think outside of the Western world, they don't have that option. Their needs are always there. They are constantly aware of their greater need for God than for material things or status or what we deem in America as our identity. So I think money is a big obstacle. We've seen the downfall of how many, mega church pastors.
Yeah.
And money and glory and, it's all a downfall. And so
let me ask you this. So obviously Dad did, and then you have as well on your own. And I know you've spent time with house churches in Southeast Asia, right? You've seen, so again, nobody's a saint. We're all broken people learning to follow Jesus. But now that you in your own journey, you've had experience, like you said, being with the persecuted church.
Yes.
You've obviously grown up in the American church culture. Nobody's going to get it perfect.
No.
But what have you seen around the world? So if you were to speak to the church in the West, just as a sort of a prophetic charge, what are the things that you have seen that you would say to the American church, these need to be the things that we're focusing on to actually see the nations reached? What for you would be the priorities? Like, what would you speak to leaders with what you've seen over the years that would be the priorities?
Okay. First, I would, no matter what context I was in, whether I was leading a small group or I was pastor of a church or somewhere in between, I would be looking always and identifying those people that have cross-cultural missions gifting on them. And they'll pop up everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't get away from it. That's all they talk about. It's what they breathe, they live. And I would do everything in my power to equip them and send them to do what God's called them to do, whether it's overseas or right in their own neighborhood.
Okay.
And that takes time, energy, and money.
Yeah.
And so we're going back to what are we doing with those things?
Right. So it's really how are we allocating those resources?
How are
that
we
really
allocating,
seems to be
and
essential.
what's our priority?
Right.
Because we all spend our money on what we want to. We all spend our time on what we want to.
Right. I can say I don't have money, but I've got a $5 latte in my hand.
Exactly.
Right. So it's very much just
so it's
how
like,
I'm prioritizing.
You know, how does that work?
Right.
And the truth is you're never going to have enough. I don't care how much you have. You're always going to want more.
Yeah.
So I think I would challenge the Western Church to, one, do life together outside of Sunday morning. I would say chuck Sunday morning. If you had a choice between small group and Sunday morning, I would always go with small group.
How come?
Because that's where you learn each other's gifts. That's where you learn how to practice the gifts you have. That's how you learn to share your heart. This is what I think God's saying, but it's so audacious that I dare not mention it.
Yeah.
I mean, they wouldn't mention that to a pastor of a church. They might not mention it to someone they don't know because it's something intimate with them. It's something God's doing with them. In a small group where you live together, you do life together, you share one another's burdens, you share one another's finances.
Right.
You give out of your lack. We don't have all of our rent, but you don't have any food. So let me give you what I have, and God will supply. It's that kind of risk, I think, that I was referring to earlier. I know that when we were in Indianapolis, we planted our church. Being in the trenches with people, doing God's work is what builds community. They are still some of my closest friends. I know in an instant that I could call them and they would they would give me the shirt off their back. I can't say that about many people that we've not been through the trenches with. People that are on the mission field, the missionaries that live on a center or a compound, they're friends for life because they've not only wounded each other, but they've healed each other. They've had to work through their conflicts because they're with each other. And, and I have nothing against all the things we have our children in all the time. But if your kids are in sports 5 nights a week, you don't even have time to get together with another couple to talk about life. What's going on? What's God doing? What are your giftings? What do you think God's saying to you? To encourage and uplift each other and edify. That doesn't happen on a Sunday morning.
So let me ask you this. Obviously, you and I are 2 different generations. You're now describing, a generation like myself raising kids. Your generation was different in many ways.
Right.
So let me just say, let's just sit there for a minute. Sort of as we think about the biblical story, we think about reaching nations and ultimately what the church is called to, right? What our focus needs to be. How does sort of individualism play into that? So you just mentioned if you've got your kids, and obviously many people would disagree with you. They would say, no, our kids need all these things, our kids.
Right.
So, what do we do with that?
Well, I would say, how is playing baseball 5 nights a week advancing the kingdom? Now, I have friends of mine that are baseball fanatics, and they coach, and their community, who God's called them to reach, are all the parents on that team. So I would say, if you're having influence with God, about God, for God and his kingdom and the grand story, go for it. But if it's baseball for the sake of baseball, that your kids learn how to play a sport, and it doesn't reach past that, I mean, I can't say for anybody but myself, but for me, that's kind of the American way. That's what our society has told us as parents, good parents, that's what we would give our kids. To the point of going into debt. To the point of sacrificing our marriages. So that's extreme. But I think it happens subtly. I don't think the enemy wants us about God's business. Because once we start taking communities for Christ and start, even if it's a baseball community for Christ, that can change a town, a city, which then can change the world. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as it's like money. As long as money doesn't become your God, there's nothing wrong with it. But as long as these activities don't become the thing that drives a family, I think those are some of the things. If I could tell your generation one thing, or any generation, my generation, doesn't matter. I'm going to tell a little story. When Jackson and I were at the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena, we were privileged enough to live next door to a couple who were in the concentration camps in China.
Oh, wow.
He was a doctor, she was a nurse. And they were there. They moved the camps all the time. And they had children. And they would keep the women apart from the men. And the women had the kids. And when they would go to they would like have these camps in old school grounds where there'd be a dilapidated like tennis court. And they would put the men on one side, the women and the kids on the other. And they would say, okay, the kids can go. And the kids would go up to the net and the men would go up to the net. That was the only interaction they had with their children. Then they would go back, then they'd let the moms come up. Anyway, these two people were in this concentration camp, and when they were finally released, they came home. They were Helen and what was his name? Dr. Wells is what I called him. Anyway, they had a house in Pasadena, and then they had a little cottage on the same property, and they were generous, and they would let different missionaries come and use that cottage when they were home on furlough or whatever. So we were teaching at the U.S. Center. They had heard that we needed a place to live, so they let us live there. So we're in this little house in the back of their big house, and there's a garage, a 3-car garage that did not have an electronic opener. It was the kind you had to pull up and then pull down. Well, Helen was in her 70s, I mean, by this time. And one day I was out in the back and picking avocados from this tree, and she came out and she was lifting up that door, and I said, Helen, why don't you get an electric garage door opener? It'd be so much easier for you. And she never was much of a talker, but when she talked, you listened, because she had a lot to say. Yeah. And I remember her telling me that we were standing by this little fence that separated her house and my house. And she said, my dear, there are 2 words that should never be in a Christian's vocabulary. One is deserved and one is settled. And I've always remembered that. Deserved, we don't deserve anything. God must do nothing. Yet, our Western life, how many things do we deserve?
Right.
What do we think we're entitled to?
Yeah.
Okay. The other one was settled. We're never settled. This is not our home. Our home is in heaven. We're just passing through. But we get settled. And that in and of itself, if you take that to its logical conclusion, that becomes our kingdom. Yeah. Wherever we live, whatever we're doing. And it's our small story.
Right.
And again, there's nothing wrong with a small story as long as the boundary lines of that
Right.
small story are not caught up in the larger story.
Right. So what would you say to people, like, so I think going forward as we have these conversations, people are going to be listening, they're going to be engaging with us as we go. What would you say to people who are going to begin to hear these things and they automatically acknowledge, I am settled. That word resonates with me. What would you say to people that are in that place?
Well, it's a really good place to be. It's very uncomfortable, but I think that's a good place to be. I would begin to pray and ask the Lord, show me how I have made this greater than you. Show me how this has become, show me the ways, the practical ways that my home and the consumption of myself into my home, or even my family, my church, whatever it is, how has that become my little story compound? You know, it's like, how have I kept, how has that become my priority?
Right.
How's that become my God, my idol?
Right.
I mean, those are the terms that the church uses. And then just start asking the Lord how to break them down. Lord, and that's going to be hard. It is very hard. It's hard to, because you feel like you're going backwards.
Okay.
You know?
So like people feel like they're losing. Like
they're losing.
Right, you're losing.
You know, but there's nothing fair about the gospel.
What do you mean?
Jesus never said it's going to be fair. In other words, when you start losing things, it's not fair. You know, when your dad died, I asked the Lord, what is that all about?
Yeah.
He had so much more to do and so much more to live for, and you know, and it's not fair. But the cross wasn't fair either. You know, so I don't think but that's where we go to. It's not fair.
Yeah.
It's not, I'm entitled. I have a right. I've even, God, I've tithed and tithed and tithed. I've gone to church. I've led Bible studies. I've witnessed. I've gone to missions. I've done everything. And then this is the payback?
So people feel like, I was entitled to this. Why didn't you give me what I deserve?
Right.
That's the mindset.
And we tend to define what that payback should look like.
So is that why you think we miss it?
I think we miss it. I think we live in a very affluent, and I don't mean just money. I mean everything. Right. I mean,
so there's a like just being in the Western world, there's a privilege maybe we don't even acknowledge, or we don't realize it's even.
I don't think we see it as a privilege. I think we see it as a right.
But I guess that would be the point of the privileged,
right?
Right. The whole point is we wouldn't see the privilege because we have it.
Because we have it.
Okay.
Right. And I don't care really what color you are or what your background came from.
Yeah.
Is we all have taken up rights that were never ours to take up.
And is that okay? So with that for a minute, I'm even thinking about nothing's going to stop it in the storyline material that we'll be unpacking for people. Even as you go to that place, then you're describing anybody from any background. Then, so is that simply a sin problem? Like just that very entitlement? Is that where that stems from?
Absolutely.
Doesn't matter where you're from,
I don't
what your
think it
life's
matters.
been.
I don't think it matters at all, because I've not met a human being yet that doesn't feel like somewhere God's drop kick them out of left field.
And then consequently, everybody else is, we're owed something. That just sort of would be the result of that rebellious.
You know, and I think that causes all kinds of division in the church.
Yeah.
And, you know, right now, there's such a political fervor, but I think the enemy has our eyes on that and not on what really matters. Is at the end of the day, are we loving?
Yeah.
Can we look at somebody who has a completely different view on immigration and say, I love you? And you know, you have a right to that opinion.
Right.
And leave it at that.
Right.
Not say, and I have a right to mine too. Don't forget that.
Right, like make sure you put your two cents in.
Yeah. It's like, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Okay, so when we think about reaching the nations, and as you're describing the ultimate goal that the church is to be unified towards, right? You just mentioned, and maybe we need to sit here for a minute, Because as we go forward and unpack conversations, right, people are going to be hearing from people from different sides of the fence. People are like people that we're going to be interviewing, that people are going to be experiencing, will be coming from different perspectives, right? And it's like you said, because of sin, because of our nature to have to control and take power over, we may naturally at times automatically go on the defensive.
We do,
right? We're even if we don't think we will, we know that we will. So let me ask you this: sort of, we can have all the church programs we want and all the conferences in the world that say the right things. What do you see in your experience, and even just biblically? What does it take for the church to actually walk out unity in a situation like ours in America? Other places in the world might be similar, where it's just so easy to be divided. Because as you mentioned, as the church is divided, I would argue Satan's just sitting on the couch.
Oh,
like the longer we're fighting with each other, lashing back on Facebook, all the things we do, like 10-year-olds, we just don't call a spade a spade. Right? We fight like kids with rocks on a playground.
Yeah.
So given that is the reality of where we live, given what you've seen and what you know of God and what you've seen of the church, what does it take to actually walk out being a unified people en route to seeing nations reached? Like, where does the rubber meet the road for you and what you've seen?
Okay, I see our journeys as, here's, again, it goes back to, if we're walking out the gospel together, unity doesn't come because we agree or disagree. Unity comes when we're doing the work of Christ together. You put a militant black, a militant white, a militant Hispanic, however you want to call us, and our mission is to go to a place in Africa, anywhere, and minister to a native group, to a tribal group. I will guarantee you that we're in the trenches. All that political stuff is going to go by the wayside. The thing we're going to see is our heart for God's people and our love for them and our ability to serve and help. Our story becomes subservient at that point. So, and I think the enemy has us battling here when the war is here.
What is the war? Like, what are we ultimately fighting? Like, what do you see?
I see us fighting for what Jesus died for, the redemption of the world, for people to know him, to know his glory, to be part of his story, to have fullness of life. Fullness of life is not going to be found in anything but Christ. I don't care where you land, what you do, how much money you have in the bank, how much money you don't have in the bank. Because our identity, if our identity is in anything other than Christ, then it's a false identity. Now, so I see us, we get stuck. We get stuck in the journey. It's like we go around the mountain and we get stuck on differences. We get stuck on the minors instead of the majors. The majors is reaching the nations for Christ. That was the Great Commission. That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
But now in America, we don't even have to go across the continents anymore, the seas. They're right here in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So I would say to the people groups that scare you the most, go to them. Do it scared. Go. Go to the mosques. Go to the temples. Go to the Catholic Church. Go to whatever it is that scares you about that people group and get to know them one-to-one. Not their religious beliefs, not their... Because that'll all come out.
Right.
But to get to know them. I was afraid of anybody Middle Eastern for the longest time because of all the stuff that was going on.
Yeah.
That became my focal point, was they're all bad. It's all terrorists. It's the they, ubiquitous they.
Right.
I would find myself trying to avoid them in the stores, not knowing what to say.
Right.
And then you started making friends with Muslims here in Corona. You took us to one of their homes. I got to know their wives. I thought, they're just like me. They're just like me. They have problems just like me. They have worries just like me. And all of a sudden, it didn't matter that they were Muslims. It didn't matter that they were of a different ilk than myself, because I saw their heart. And then I loved them because they didn't know Jesus yet. And I thought, I'm going to pray for them. Pray for them. Don't reject them. Don't put them in some category that they're different than you are. They are not different than we are. Every person ever born was made in the image of God.
So that's the common ground.
Common ground. That's the only ground.
Yeah.
To fight, to lay your life down for. All this other crap, it's going to go by the wayside.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to get through this, but there are people around the world that don't know Jesus. And our commission, our goal, our priority, however that fleshes out in your life. But if you don't know that's the storyline, you don't know that the end from the beginning, you won't know, you'll think your story's right here.
Right.
And it stops right there. But it's not that.
And so if we so kind of hearing the part you were just sharing then, what I would be hearing then is, if we don't know the story, it's very easy to see our Muslim neighbor is the enemy from some place, because that's what the world's told us, versus a person who needs to be loved and who Jesus loves. Like that would be the center of the conversation.
That would be the center.
Yeah.
See, that's the major.
That's the major.
That's the major. To me.
Right.
And I see that in Scripture. I mean, for goodness sakes, Jesus was Middle Eastern. I mean, you know, if we're going to,
if we're going to stereotype, we're kind of doing it backwards.
We're kind of doing it backwards.
Yeah.
And it doesn't just have to be race.
Right.
We do that in every arena of life. We do it in our finances. You know, we do it in name dropping. You know, well, I know so and so, and you tell your story, and you've got all these names you're dropping in, so that people, it's a false identity. It's not who you're meant to be.
Yeah.
I mean, who you are. It's your background is just where you're from.
Right.
Your nationality is what you were born into.
Right.
But Christ gives you your identity.
Right.
Not any of that stuff.
Yeah.
Not your political affiliation. If you're a Christian, your identity comes from Christ and Christ alone.
Right.
Doesn't come from the other stuff.
Given all that, let me ask you one final question, sort of in a few parts. If you were then to speak to, we've got a few generations, right? Let's say there's teenagers, we got young adults, we have those of my age raising kids, those in your generation now watching their kids raising kids. If you were just to give a couple words, even if it's just brief, what would be your heart for each of those generations? Going from like a teenager figuring out junior high and high school, maybe young people figuring out the rest of their life, which we tell them they have to do by 18, right? Parents raising kids, and then those of your wisdom generation now with their grandbabies around. What would you say to each of the generations? Like, what's your heart for each of those groups?
Well, you mean individually or collectively?
Well, maybe both.
To the younger people, I would probably say what our parents have all told us. You know, be true to yourself. Peer pressure is, I don't know, it's really hard for young people because there's so much pressure to adapt and conform to what the world is telling you have to be and have to look like.
Yeah.
And so I think, again, I don't think it's something that person can do alone. I think they need their family or whatever group, their community around them to reinforce who God's made them to be. And to help pull out and be close enough and spend enough time with that young person to know what and who has God called you to be. You know, early on, I think we can see giftings on people,
Yeah.
and to be able to call those out and identify them for the person,
Right.
help them along the path that God has for them, letting them know you're going to make mistakes, you're going to screw up, but that's okay,
Yeah.
because God is a God of forgiveness.
Right.
And if the people around a young child are not forgiving, he won't learn that, because we're the ones that represent who God is to young people.
Yeah.
So if parents are not reflections of Jesus in all of their brokenness,
Right.
then their children aren't going to know.
Yeah.
So, and for the what was the next one?
Well, let's go. What would you say to parents that would be in where Kirsten and I are with our girls? We have bills, we have mortgages, we're just trying to survive parenting. All we think we have time for is barely an hour and a half on a Sunday. With what you've seen, what would you say to everybody in that stage in life who's just trying to get by, let alone have any bandwidth to even think about anything you've been talking about?
Then I think you just have to be okay with where you're at. I mean, because God has you there.
Yeah.
And begin to ask the Lord, are there things that we're putting our hands to, our money to, our energy to, that could be better spent in your story? And it takes time.
Yeah.
You know, are there doors, Father, are there doors that we're not walking through that are right there? Show us what they are.
Right.
Are there, things that we could be praying into, people we could be meeting with, along the lines of whatever our daily tasks look like.
Right, right.
Are there people at work? I mean, you spend a lot of time at work. Father, are there people here that I can pray for?
Yeah.
Have someone come to me with a headache. Give me a word of knowledge about somebody. Give me a word of wisdom for somebody.
Right.
Give me a word of encouragement. Everybody in the world needs encouragement.
Yeah.
You don't even need to have a word from God for that one.
Yeah.
You can just be about encouraging.
So you would say to people to become aware of what the Spirit's doing in their everyday moments, where they already are.
Right. Because it's by the work of the Spirit that we can do any of this anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise it just becomes what we can do, and we know where all that lands.
Yeah.
You know, God's going to, that'll implode. So it is, I think, you know, I wrote a little book, and one of the chapters in there is there's no such thing as balance in our life. I don't believe there's a balance. You know, how do I balance kids? How do I balance being a wife? How do I balance being a worker? How blah, blah, blah. How do I be a balance a Christian? I don't think there's a balance. God asks for all of it. And then he's the one who dispenses grace on all the things that we're about.
Yeah.
And so it's really a freeing thing.
Right.
Because we don't have to do it. We just have to pray and ask God, what are you doing in my life? What are you doing in my family's life?
Right.
And then sit long enough or pray 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there. God knows our schedules.
Right.
We're more worried about that than he is. And this is the whole thing of nothing's going to stop it. Nothing is going to stop God's plan.
Yeah.
In your life, in my life, regardless of what we're doing or not doing. But if we open ourselves up and say, Lord, what are you doing?
Yeah.
He's going to show us.
So what about for your generation?
My generation, I think what I see my generation can do for whoever God brings into our path is to share Jesus in a practical, simple way that with a larger story in mind, and whatever that is. If I'm talking to you about missions, if I'm talking to Kirsten about raising her children, and I think I don't see my role anymore as a teacher. I did at one point. I don't have that platform anymore. But I think at my role as a grandma, as a mom, is to, when God opens the door for me to share whatever it is he has, to do whatever it is he has.
Yeah.
If we're, if I have the kids and we're at a store and the lady in front of me, I can tell she's not feeling well. I take my grandkids and I say, may we pray for you?
Yeah.
Right there in the store.
So there's no retirement in the kingdom in that sense.
No, there's not a retirement. And I think, again, God's plan for each one of us is his plan. And so he's going to give us giftings. Like, I know that one of mine is I love relationships. I'm very relational. I like to sit and have coffee with people and talk about things that are important to them and give them whatever nuggets I have from the Lord. But mine is to share the love of Christ in a mature, non-judgmental way. To teach people that that's the character of Christ.
Yeah.
And in doing so, expose everyone that God brings my way to the larger story, the other cultures of the world, the other world outside the United States. The United States is not Mecca.
Yeah.
And we can do that in all sorts of ways. So like we have a good friend of ours who's a missionary in Thailand working with human trafficking, and I'll sit down and talk to my 4-year-old grandson about what's going on.
Yeah.
That there are kids in the world that are being taken from their parents and made into slaves. I'll use words that he understands.
Right.
But to let him know there is something outside of Eastvale, California.
Yeah.
And God is about that.
Yeah.
God is about all the nations, not just this one.
Yeah.
And then, Lincoln, how can we pray for one of your friends? How can we pray for you?
So at 4 years old it starts.
4 years old, or however old they are.
Yeah.
So that's it's probably not what you answered. But
it's perfect because it was your response. It's great.
And so that's kind of what I see is just being able to be Jesus to people and know that I make mistakes and owning them. That's a big part. I think it's real important to say, your dad used to always say this, it's important to say, you could be right and I could be wrong. All the time, remember that. Keep a humble attitude. You don't have the answers. You don't even know the questions most of the time.
Yeah. Wow. That's good. Mom, thanks for doing this.
You're welcome.
It's awesome.
You're welcome.
Well, everybody, until the next conversation, grace and peace.